My name is Selah Vance. I'm 27 years old, a lead forensic structural engineer, and for the last 17 years, I have been the daughter of a man who taught me that truth is the only structure that never collapses. My job is to walk into the skeletal remains of buildings, the twisted rebar, the pulverized concrete, and find the exact millisecond where a design failed. I deal in the physics of consequences. People often think structures fall because of a single massive blow. But usually it's a slow, invisible rot in the foundation that finally meets a moment of high pressure. My mother never listened to my explanation. At 10, she threw me out on a stormy November night with only a trash bag of clothes and the label of a liar. A powerful man, Judge Sterling Thorne, took me in. He didn't just give me a home. He gave me the tools to decode the world. Now, 17 years later, the woman who erased me has returned to beg for help, until I told her I would never help a murderer. But before we get to the reckoning, you need to understand the night the foundation finally gave way. It was 3:07 a.m. on a Tuesday. The ICU at Hartford Memorial has a specific sound, a relentless rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the sterile hum of monitors that feel like they are counting down a life. The air smelled of ozone and that sharp industrial disinfectant that stays in the back of your throat. I stood behind the glass, watching Sterling Thorne. He lay under a tangle of wires, his face bruised a deep violet shade. A hit and run, the police had said. Blunt force trauma. The surgeon, a man with tired eyes and a voice like gravel, stood beside me. His intracranial pressure is spiking, Selah. We need to operate now to relieve the swelling. If we wait another hour, the damage will be permanent. I reached for the paperwork, my hands steady despite the coldness in my chest, but the surgeon stopped me. There's a problem. The hospital records show the medical power of attorney is still under review in probate court because of the recent updates Sterling made to his estate. Legally, since you aren't his biological daughter and the final papers haven't been stamped, I need a signature from his next of kin or a direct relative to proceed with emergency intervention. According to the old filings, that's your biological mother, Selah Vance. She's still listed as the primary emergency contact from the transition period years ago. It was a structural flaw in my own life. To save the man who had rescued me, I had to call the woman who had discarded me. Vera arrived at 3:42 a.m. She wasn't wearing a coat, just a designer silk scarf draped perfectly over her shoulders. She didn't walk toward the bed where Sterling lay fighting for breath. Instead, she stopped at the nurse's station, adjusting her hair in the reflection of the glass. When she finally entered the room, she didn't touch my hand. She didn't look at the monitors. She placed a manila folder on the rolling hospital table, right next to Sterling's IV line. "Selah, you look tired," she said. Her voice was thin, practiced, like a script she'd rehearsed in the car. She didn't ask how he was. She didn't ask if I was okay. "He needs surgery, Vera," I said, my voice low. "The doctors need your signature. Now." She didn't pick up the pen. She tapped the folder. "I need you to look at the Glastonbury project report first. Dax's construction company is facing a $2 million default because of that structural audit you filed last week. The bank is freezing his assets. If you don't sign this acceptance form and backdate it by 48 hours, Dax loses everything." I looked at the man on the bed, the man who had taught me to ride a bike and read blueprints. Then I looked at the woman who saw his death as a business opportunity. "Sign the medical release, Vera," I repeated. She leaned in, her perfume clashing with the smell of the ICU. "Sign the report, Selah. If Sterling Thorne dies tonight, your protection dies with him. You'll be that 10-year-old girl with a trash bag again. No one will believe a forensic engineer who was kicked out for being a violent liar. Dax will make sure you're taken care of if you do this. We can be a family again." It was a professional blackmail, a trade, a signature for a life. I realized then that my mother didn't see a daughter. She saw a tool. She didn't see a dying man. She saw a clearance of debt. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Sterling always told me that when the pressure is too much, you shouldn't fight the weight. You find a way to redistribute it. I picked up my phone and dialed Kaylin, my lead assistant. Kaylin, wake up. I need you to freeze the Glastonbury site immediately. File an emergency notice with the state inspectors. I'm declaring a total structural integrity breach based on the newest data. No one enters, and no insurance payouts are to be authorized. Vera's face went white. What are you doing? I ignored her and turned to the head nurse who was standing by the door, witnessing the exchange. I am paying for the surgery deposit out of my personal trust fund. Here is the card. I am also calling the hospital ombudsman and providing an emergency affidavit. My lawyer is on the way. If this woman refuses to sign the medical release while attempting to extort a state-certified engineer, I want it documented for the police. The nurse nodded, her jaw set. She had seen enough. I'll get the ombudsman, Miss Vance. I looked at Vera. I pulled up my banking app. For 3 years, I had quietly sent $1,500 every month to help with her mortgage in Glastonbury. A silent attempt to buy a love that wasn't for sale. I tapped cancel recurring transfer. I felt the weight of an old imaginary debt finally lift. Then, I blocked her number. One trash bag of clothes turned me into a stranger, I said, looking her dead in the eye. But one signature refusal turned me into a judge. You chose Dax's money over Sterling's life. Don't ever call me again. She stood there, speechless, as I walked her out of the room. The surgery doors closed behind Sterling 10 minutes later. I sat in the empty hallway, the silence finally stretching out, clean and cold. A soft knock on the waiting room glass broke the quiet. It was Officer Miller from the Hartford PD. He looked at me with a grim expression and held up a small, clear evidence bag. Ms. Vance? We processed the vehicle debris from the scene. We found this wedged in the radiator grill of the car that struck the judge. It must have been torn off the driver's jacket during the struggle before he fled. I looked at the bag. Inside was a heavy, tarnished silver button. It was old-fashioned, embossed with a Gothic, intricate letter D. I knew that button. I had seen it on a navy wool coat hanging in the hallway of the Glastonbury house just last week. The world didn't collapse in that moment. It just finally found its center. I wasn't just saving Sterling's life anymore. I was beginning the audit of a murder. Now, let me take you back to the fall of 2009 in Glastonbury, Connecticut. It was a town of manicured lawns and historic red brick, where the appearance of stability was worth more than the truth itself. My family home sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, a white colonial that looked perfect from the sidewalk, but inside, the foundation was already shifting. In our house, love wasn't a feeling. It was a ranking system. You didn't receive it because you were a daughter. You earned it by how well you maintained my mother's carefully curated narrative. Vera was the architect of our lives. She didn't just run the household, she managed our identities. Dax, my 14-year-old brother, was the spirited golden child. Every window he broke or a neighbor he insulted was dismissed as high energy or a misunderstanding. Cressida, my older sister, was the ornament, the proof that Vera was a successful mother. Then there was me. I was the problem. Even at 10, I had a forensic mind. I noticed the cracks in the walls, the discrepancies in the stories, and the quiet rot beneath the floorboards. Dax was celebrated for his chaos. I was managed for my clarity. One afternoon in October stands out with surgical precision. I had won first place in the regional science fair for a model of a suspension bridge. I stood on the school stage for 40 minutes after the ceremony, clutching my trophy, waiting for the family Lexus to pull into the lot. When Vera finally arrived, her eyes were red and her jaw was set. She didn't look at my trophy. She didn't ask about the presentation. Selah, don't be so selfish with your little plastic cup, she said as I climbed into the back seat. Your brother was suspended for roughhousing again. He's in his room crying. He needs a mother right now. You just need an audience. I swallowed the lump in my throat and placed the trophy on the floor mat. I told myself it made sense. Dax was fragile. I was sturdy. He needed the attention because he couldn't hold himself together. I could handle the silence. I didn't realize that in my family, being able to handle the silence meant they would never stop giving it to me. 3 weeks later was my 10th birthday. I spent the evening sitting at the kitchen table, watching the clock on the oven. Vera had forgotten to buy a cake because she was busy organizing Cressida's audition for a private ballet school in Hartford. We ended up eating 2 slices of leftover pepperoni pizza that Dax hadn't finished. "I'll make it up to you, Selah," Vera said, not looking up from Cressida's application forms. "Cressida has a real future in dance. You're smart enough to understand that some things are just more urgent." I nodded and wiped the grease from the table. I rationalized it. I was the strong one. I didn't need the fuss. I was an engineer in training, and I knew that sometimes you have to sacrifice the non-essential parts of a structure to keep the main frame standing. I just didn't know I was the part being sacrificed. The collapse happened on November 14th. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, and sleet was hitting the windows like birdshot. I was in the upstairs hallway looking out the window when I saw Dax on the front porch. He was arguing with our 70-year-old neighbor, Mr. Miller, over a stray ball that had landed in his flower beds. Dax was towering over him, his face contorted. In a sudden flash of movement, Dax reached out and pushed. It wasn't a rough push. It was a calculated shove. Mr. Miller went backward off the porch steps, his body hitting the frozen ground with a sound I can still hear when the room gets too quiet. He didn't move. I rushed into the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mom, Dax pushed Mr. Miller. He fell off the porch. He's not moving anymore." Vera didn't reach for the phone. She didn't run outside. She grabbed my shoulders, her grip so tight it left bruises that would turn plum-colored by morning. "You are a liar, Selah," she hissed, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "You've always been jealous of your brother. You want to destroy this family because you aren't the center of attention?" "But I saw him, Mom. He's lying there." "No," she said, her eyes turning into flint. "You saw nothing. And since you want to tell stories to the police, you can find a new place to tell them." She didn't yell. She walked to my room, grabbed a black, heavy-duty trash bag from the utility closet, and began raking my clothes into it with mechanical efficiency. She opened the front door, letting the sleet swirl into the foyer. She handed me the bag. "Go," she said. "Since you're so determined to be violent and delusional, go find someone else to believe your lies. Don't come back until you learn to protect your own." 10 minutes after I left, she called the police. Years later, I learned she hadn't reported the neighbor's accident at all. She reported me as a runaway with a history of violence. She turned my truth into a crime before I had even walked down the street. I walked 3 miles in that sleet. My sneakers were soaked through by the first mile, and the trash bag ripped at the corner, spilling my favorite sweater into a puddle. I ended up at the precinct on Main Street. That was the night I met Sterling Thorne. He was the presiding judge on night duty, and he was the first person in my life who didn't look at me and see a problem. He looked at my wet clothes, my torn bag, and the bruises on my shoulders, and he saw a witness. I thought that was the end of the ranking system. I thought once I was out of that house, I was free. I didn't know then that the shadow Vera cast wasn't just emotional. I didn't know that for 17 years, she was building a ledger of my name, using my silence to fund my brother's future. I didn't realize I wasn't just forgotten. I was being archived for a different kind of exploitation. They say that time heals all wounds, but as a forensic engineer, I know better. Time doesn't heal. It merely allows the grass to grow over the sinkhole. It provides a veneer of stability while the pressure builds underneath. 3 years ago, when I was promoted to lead forensic engineer at my firm in Hartford, the Glastonbury freeze suddenly thawed. After 14 years of silence, 14 years where my name was only spoken in my mother's house as a cautionary tale, the temperature changed. It started with a Facebook tag. Vera had shared a local business journal article featuring my promotion with the caption, "So proud of my youngest, Selah, the genius in the family." Suddenly, there were Sunday brunches at a high-end bistro in West Hartford. For the first time since I was 10, I wasn't the violent runaway. I was the successful daughter. I sat across from Vera, watching her sip a mimosa, her eyes bright and seemingly full of affection. I know that now. Back then, I thought a university degree and a 6-figure salary were enough of a bridge to cross back to them. I thought my accomplishments had finally eroded their cruelty the way water erodes limestone. I didn't understand that limestone only looks soft until the moment it's ready to crush you. I always kept a small, rectangular plate of polished surgical steel in my blazer pocket. It was a graduation gift from Sterling Thorne. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and perfectly flat. It was my anchor. It reminded me that while Vera's warmth was a seasonal shift, dependent on the weather of her own needs, Sterling's support was a constant physical law. When I sat at those brunches, feeling the desperate hunger to be loved, I would reach into my pocket and run my thumb along the steel's edge. It kept me grounded in the facts. Then came Cressida. My older sister became the bridge. She started texting me every morning, little messages that felt like sisterhood. Thinking of you, Selah. How's the lab today? She remembered my coffee order. She remembered the specific names of my colleagues. She even remembered my deep-seated fear of stormy Tuesday nights. I was so starved for a reflection of myself in my own family that I didn't see she was performing a forensic sweep of her own. Are you working on any big state contracts? She'd ask over a glass of Pinot. Does Sterling still keep that private archive in his study? He must have so much influence in the city. I told her everything. I told her about the stress load simulations I was running for the new Glastonbury Bridge project. I told her about Sterling's declining health and the complexities of managing his estate. I poured my life into her open hands, thinking I was finally being seen. I didn't realize I was just providing the blueprints. I was handing her the ammunition they would eventually use to try and bury me. The first ask happened on a drizzly afternoon in April. Vera called me, her voice trembling with a vulnerability I hadn't heard before. "Selah, I'm so embarrassed to ask," she whispered. "But Dax had a medical emergency. The insurance is tied up in a bureaucratic mess, and there's a $500 invoice for a specialist. Just this once, honey. Only for a month until the paperwork clears. You're the only one who can save the family from this stress." I was sitting in my car in the lab parking lot. I stared at my bank balance on my phone. A cold knot formed in my stomach, a survival instinct I ignored. I told myself this was an investment. This was the entrance fee for a normal family life. I hit send on the transfer. "Thank you, Selah," she said. "You've always been the dependable one." That was the beginning of my ATM training. The $500 one-time help evolved into a $1,500 monthly mortgage assistance for the Glastonbury house. Then Dax's contracting business needed a bridge loan for new equipment. Then Cressida needed help with a minor legal fee. It became a subscription service to my own family. I noticed Vera was also tapping into a dormant savings account my biological father had left behind. Money that had been intended for my graduate school, which she had redirected to cover Dax's mounting gambling debts. Because I am an engineer, I couldn't help but document the rot. I kept an encrypted spreadsheet on my private server. Column A was the date. Column B was the amount. Column C was the reason they gave. Column D was the reality. May 12th, $1,500. Mortgage. Notes. Vera said she was short. August 19th, $4,200. Dax's tax issue. Notes. He didn't say thank you. Over 3 years, the shock total reached $86,000. I had quietly bought my way back into their lives, dollar by dollar, but the price of admission didn't include respect. At a family dinner to celebrate Dax's new contract, which I later found out was a subcontract he'd secured using my professional credentials without my knowledge, Vera patted my hand. "You're so smart, Selah," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "It's a shame you've always been so cold and difficult to love, but at least you're useful now. Sterling taught you well. He taught you how to be a tool." The table went quiet. Dax chuckled into his wine. Cressida adjusted her pearls. I felt the familiar burn in my chest, but I didn't say a word. I just touched the steel plate in my pocket. I realized that my value to them was strictly structural. I was the load-bearing pillar they could pile their debts and lies onto, as long as I remained silent. I handed them the key to my life, every detail of my work, and the very ammunition they would use to try and dismantle me. I didn't know it yet, but the reckoning was coming. And as any engineer will tell you, when you ignore the signs of a failing foundation, the collapse is never a question of if, But when? It would start with a phone call in the middle of a Tuesday night, and the cost would be far higher than $86,000. Thursday morning, October 14th. That was the day the last pillar of my denial finally cracked open. Vera had called the night before, her voice soft, draped in the kind of fragile piety she wore like a Sunday dress. She wanted to visit my biological father's grave at Memorial Heights Cemetery in Hartford. She said it was for closure. I went because a small, irrational part of me, the child who still remembered the smell of her bacon, hoped that a cemetery might be the one place where she couldn't lie. The morning was crisp, the air smelling of damp earth and cloying, freshly cut grass. We stood over the granite headstone, the wind whistling through the marble monuments like a low, mournful flute. Vera didn't offer a prayer. Instead, she reached into her leather tote and pulled out a manila envelope. The texture of the paper felt like fine sandpaper against my skin. "Selah, we need to settle the estate matters," she said, her voice steady. "It's a joint inheritance and asset consolidation agreement. It's what your father would have wanted, to keep the family interest together under one roof." I didn't look at the signature line. I scanned the legalese. My forensic brain began to deconstruct the paragraphs like I was inspecting a failing joist. It wasn't about an inheritance. It was a piercing the corporate veil trap. Dax's construction company was drowning in $2.4 million of debt from the Glastonbury project. Debts incurred from gross negligence and substandard materials. By signing this, I wasn't consolidating family assets. I was merging my independent forensic lab, my professional insurance, and my personal savings with their toxic liabilities. I was being asked to fund my brother's crimes with my life's work. I checked my watch. 1:15 p.m. I had exactly 165 minutes until the Hartford Superior Court closed at 4 p.m. I had the final Glastonbury Bridge audit in my bag, the one that would officially flag Dax's company for structural fraud. If I didn't file it today, the legal window for the state's investigation would narrow, and the evidence I'd gathered would be buried under a mountain of Dax's countersuits. "I'm not signing this, Vera," I said. My voice was calm, but I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. "This is an indemnity waiver for Dax. It's not an inheritance agreement." Vera's face didn't change, but her eyes went cold. Dax stepped out from behind a large willow tree. He wasn't wearing his work gear. He was in a navy wool coat, the one with the silver buttons. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. He simply walked to my shoulder bag, which I'd set on the stone bench, reached in, and took my car keys. "You aren't leaving until you help your family, Selah," he said, dropping the keys into his pocket. "Think of it as a family meeting that hasn't ended yet." I looked at Cressida, who was leaning against Vera's idling Lexus 20 yards away, scrolling through her phone. "Cressida," I called out, "just give me a ride to the courthouse. It's 20 minutes. I'll pay for the gas. I have a deadline that affects people's safety." She didn't look up. My phone buzzed in my hand. The Vance Family Circle group chat was active. Cressida, 1:42 p.m. "Our CEO sister thinks her bridge report is more important than Dad's memory. She's throwing a tantrum at the grave." Vera, 1:44 p.m. "She's always been a burden. Let her walk. Maybe the fresh air will clear her delusions." Status, seen by all. They got into the Lexus. I stood in the dirt by the headstone and watched the red taillights fade as they drove out of the cemetery gates, leaving my car locked and useless. I didn't scream after them. I didn't cry. An engineer knows that when a structure is under terminal stress, panic only accelerates the collapse. I turned around and saw Officer Higgins, the cemetery's private security guard, sitting in his patrol car 50 feet away. He had seen Dax take the bag. He walked over, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. "Everything okay, miss? I saw the gentleman withholding your property." I showed him my phone screen, the timestamps of the messages and the car keys Dax had pocketed. He tapped his shoulder-mounted camera. "I'm logging this. Body cam's active. That's a civil disturbance and unauthorized withholding of property. Do you need a report filed?" "Yes," I said. "I need police incident report #HF 9022. And I need a witness for a court deadline." I didn't wait for them to have a change of heart. I pulled out my phone and booked a premium emergency transport, a private security courier service that Sterling Thorne had kept on retainer for high-stakes site visits. It cost a $350 flat fee, triple the rate of a standard ride. I swiped the card without a second thought. It was the best $350 I had ever spent. I made it to the Hartford Superior Court clerk at 3:52 p.m. My hands were steady as I handed over the Glastonbury audit. I watched the clerk press the official "Received" stamp onto the cover page. Document: State Forensic Audit #77B. Time: 3:56 p.m. Location: Hartford, Connecticut. I didn't go back to the apartment Sterling and I shared. I didn't call Vera to ask for my keys. I booked a room at the Goodwin Hotel under a corporate name. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the rain start to streak the windows, and I realized that my family had spent years trying to convince me I was the one who was broken or difficult. But the truth was in the paperwork. They hadn't come to the cemetery to remember a father. They had come to strip mine a daughter. Strangers showed up to keep me safe. My family only showed up to rob me of my future. That was the moment I realized the bridge back to them wasn't just damaged, it was non-existent. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to try and fix it. I was going to be the one who documented its fall. It was 2:14 a.m. in my office at Vance Forensic Lab, 3 days after the cemetery incident. Outside, the city lights of Hartford were muted by a low, clinging fog. Inside, the only light came from the blue glow of my 3 monitors and the blinking LEDs of the server rack. The room was cold. It smelled of bitter, metallic cold espresso and the faint ozone scent of a high-end air purifier. On my mahogany desk, right next to my drafting pens, sat the clear evidence bag from Officer Miller. The silver button with the Gothic D seemed to catch the screen's light, a small, tarnished accusation. I looked down at my right forearm. There was a bruise there, the size of a silver dollar, where Dax had gripped me to keep me from my car. It had turned a deep, ugly shade of plum. I didn't touch it. I didn't apply ice. I simply looked at it through my engineer's eyes, measuring its diameter and noting the discoloration. It was just more data in a career built on measuring the force of impact. I turned my chair to look at the digital scan of the Glastonbury Bridge blueprints. I had spent my life studying how structures hold weight, yet I had spent 17 years ignoring the fact that my family was a structural flaw. They weren't a foundation, they were a sinkhole. Every dollar I had sent, every silence I had kept, had been a temporary shoring up of a building that was never meant to stand. I realized then that I had been playing the role of the submissive daughter for a mother who didn't exist. Vera was a curator of appearances, and I was just a project she'd abandoned once the maintenance got too high. I had 2 choices as I sat there in the dark: keep paying the interest on their debts, or stop the bleeding. I chose to stop the bleeding. I pulled my laptop closer. The mechanical click of the keys was the only sound in the office. I logged into my primary banking portal. For 3 years, the automatic transfers had been the silent heartbeat of my relationship with Vera. Every month, like clockwork, money flowed from my sweat and late-night audits into her mortgage support and Dax's insurance reserve. I opened the recurring payments tab. It was a list of my own exploitation. Delete transfer, $1,500 to Vera Vance. Confirm. Delete transfer, $2,800 to Dax Construction LLC. Confirm. Revoke secondary account authorization for Vera Vance. Confirm. Change 2FA settings to my private satellite phone. Confirm. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I didn't feel a surge of anger. I felt the sound of a circuit breaker flipping in an old house. The weight didn't vanish. I just finally decided it wasn't mine to carry. I went to the Vance Family Circle group chat. I didn't leave the group. I didn't send a manifesto. I simply tapped mute permanently. Just as I was about to close the browser, a notification pinged on my second screen. A Google alert for my name. I clicked it, and my heart slowed. Cressida had released a 45-second video on her lifestyle and heritage platform. It was the cemetery footage Dax had recorded on his phone, but it had been surgically edited. It showed Vera, looking frail and small, weeping at the grave, while I stood a few feet away, silent and cold, clutching my briefcase. The caption read, "When success turns a daughter into a monster." Selah Vance, CEO of Vance Forensic, refuses to help her grieving mother during a family crisis. Is a career worth your soul? The comments were already metastasizing. Within 5 minutes, a new email hit my inbox. It was from the Connecticut Professional Standards Board. Subject: Notice of Administrative Review. License #77SV. Due to a formal ethics complaint regarding your behavioral stability and professional conduct, your lead forensic license is under immediate administrative review pending a hearing. They weren't just going for my money anymore. They were going for the only thing Sterling had helped me build: my name. They move fast when the faucet runs dry, a voice said from the doorway. I didn't jump. I knew the sound of Kalen's boots. He walked in carrying a cardboard carrier with 2 cups of black coffee. He didn't look at me with pity. He set a cup on my desk and nodded toward the screen. I checked the metadata on that video while I was in the elevator, Kalen said, his voice level. It was uploaded from a VPN registered to Cressida's PR firm. You want me to draft a rebuttal? I can have the cemetery security logs and the police report on the wire by 6 a.m. I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot and bitter. No, I said. Let the noise be loud. If we fight now, it looks like a family squabble. I need the silence for what comes next. Facts don't need a PR campaign, they just need a venue. I turned back to the server. I navigated to a hidden partition I had discovered only after Sterling's accident. It was a secure folder titled, For Selah, in case of failure. I hovered the cursor over a sealed PDF. I didn't open it yet. I knew that once I did, there would be no going back. Sterling hadn't just been my mentor. He had been a judge who saw the rot in the Vance family from the moment I walked into his precinct at 10 years old. He had spent 17 years documenting the very things I had been too afraid to look at. I finally stopped negotiating with people who don't love me, Kalen, I said, my voice sounding more like Sterling's than my own. I'm not building a bridge back to them anymore. I'm building a case. Kalen leaned against the doorframe, his shadow long across the blueprints. They're going to notice the bank balance before they notice your absence, you know. I count on it, I replied. Vera cares about the narrative, but she lives for the numbers. She'll see the zeros in her account at 9 a.m., and she'll realize the daughter she thought she could manage has finally learned the value of a solid structure. I thought the silence would be the hardest part of the war. I didn't realize it was actually the fortress I was building around myself. I knew the fallout was coming. The calls, the threats, the escalation. But I didn't expect how truly desperate they would become when the cash stopped flowing. I was no longer a victim waiting for a sign. I was a forensic lead looking at a crime scene, and I was about to dismantle the entire Vance legacy, brick by brick. My apartment in downtown Hartford is a study in structural integrity. Everything is industrial steel, floor-to-ceiling glass, and reinforced concrete. I have a high-end espresso machine that pulls exactly 19 bars of pressure and a gray tabby cat named Sector who sleeps on a heated pad by the radiator. It is quiet. It is mine. In engineering, we speak of load-bearing silence, the kind of stillness that indicates a structure is perfectly balanced. For the last few years, I thought I had achieved that balance. But every Tuesday night, when the rain hits the glass, I find myself counting the chairs at my dining table. One for me, one for Sterling, currently empty. Despite the success of Vance Forensic, I still keep a heavy-duty black trash bag tucked into the very back of my closet, beneath my winter coats. I don't use it. I just need to know it's there to remind me that everything I own can still fit into a single bag if the world decides to turn its back again. I haven't been forgotten by my biological family. I've been archived as a liability. The load shifted at 10:14 p.m. on Friday. I was reviewing a seismic report when my work phone buzzed. It was Kalen. His voice was tight, stripped of its usual professional cadence. Selah, we have a catastrophic failure. Sector 4 of the Glastonbury Bridge project. A partial structural collapse occurred during the late-shift concrete pour. Dax's crew is on the deck. The state fire marshal is on site, and they are bypassing the standard list. They're calling for a forensic consultant immediately. You're still on the emergency rotation. I didn't think about the smear campaign Cressida had launched or the administrative review hanging over my license. Structures don't care about PR. They care about gravity. I'm moving, I said. It took me exactly 4 minutes to swap my silk lounge pants for heavy-duty work denim and steel-toed boots. I grabbed my drone kit and my hard hat. I was doing 85 miles per hour on I-84 within 6 minutes, the wipers struggling against a sudden, violent October downpour. The drive from downtown to the perimeter of the Glastonbury site took 18 minutes. My GPS estimated an ETA of 10:36 p.m. I pulled past the first police barricade at 10:34. The scene was a chaotic mosaic of blue and red lights reflecting off jagged rebar and wet cement. The air smelled of damp earth, hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, coppery scent of fear. I stepped out of my truck and the mud immediately claimed my boots. I found the fire chief near the command trailer. "I am Selah Vance, lead forensic consultant," I said, flashing my ID. "I need to disclose a potential conflict of interest. My brother is the primary contractor. However, under the emergency safety statutes, I am authorized to perform the initial stability assessment. Record that in the log." The chief didn't care about my family tree. He pointed to the mangled skeleton of Sector 4. "The northern support beam sheared. We have 3 men unaccounted for. We need to know if it's safe to send a recovery team under the slab." I deployed my thermal imaging drone. I didn't use a controller. I used my tablet, my fingers moving with a precision that comes from 1,000 hours of disaster simulation. I am a specialist and find the exact point where things give up. I hovered the drone over the failed support beam, switching to high-definition optics. The screen showed the torsion crack, a jagged, ugly split where the steel had twisted before snapping. But as I zoomed in, something didn't look right. The shear wasn't natural. There, wedged deep inside the torsion crack of the main load-bearing beam, was a sharp metallic glint. I stabilized the drone, bringing the lens within inches of the crevice. My breath hitched. It was a silver button, tarnished, heavy, and embossed with a Gothic, intricate letter D. It was the twin to the button found in the grille of the car that struck Sterling. This wasn't a structural accident. Dax hadn't just used bad materials. He had been at this specific failure point, likely sabotaging the jack stands to trigger a collapse for an insurance payout, and Sterling must have caught him in the act. "Selah, get that thing out of there." I looked up from the screen. Standing behind the yellow caution tape, drenched and furious, were Vera and Dax. They were arguing with a junior officer, trying to push their way into the hot zone. Dax saw me first. His face went from anger to a frozen, pale mask of realization. Then his eyes dropped to the badge clipped to my high-vis vest. "Selah Vance, lead forensic consultant." Vera stopped mid-sentence. She looked at my boots, caked in the mud of her son's crime scene, and then up at my face. For the first time in 17 years, she wasn't looking at a daughter she could manage. She was looking at the state's primary witness. We stood there for 5 measured seconds. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic whir of the drone's rotors and the heavy rain hitting Dax's expensive leather jacket, the one that was missing its silver buttons. I didn't feel a need for revenge. I felt the profound, quiet weight of the truth finally taking its place in the world. I turned back to the fire chief, my voice as steady as the steel Sterling had raised me to be. "Sector 4 is unstable," I said, loud enough for Vera to hear. "And I have found physical evidence of human interference at the primary failure point. Seal the site. This is no longer an accident. This is a crime scene." Facts started to speak in the silence. And as I watched the police move toward my brother, I knew that the world hadn't collapsed. It had just finally found its center. I was about to dismantle their entire legacy, brick by brick, and this time, I wouldn't be leaving in a trash bag. The rhythmic whir of my laser printer was the only sound in the Vance forensic lab during the dead of night. It was 2 a.m. on Monday. I wasn't printing a story or a manifesto. I was printing an audit. I watched the sheets slide out, warm to the touch, the ink still smelling of heated chemicals. I organized them with the precision of a structural blueprint. The 2009 police report Vera had filed, the bank statements showing $86,000 in redirected funds, and the high-resolution thermal scans from the Glastonbury Bridge site. I tightly bound the spines of a thick, black hardcover file. I used the typed labels: breach of fiduciary duty, physical evidence, crime scene destruction. My hands trembled slightly as I clipped Dr. Margolis's final statement to the competence section. It wasn't a tremor of fear, but the exhilaration of a technician finally identifying the crux of a long-standing lie. I wasn't prepared to win an argument. I was prepared to prevent a collapse. By 4 p.m., the sky over Glastonbury had turned a bruised, heavy gray. Vera had called me 4 times, her voice sounding uncharacteristically desperate. She invited me to the old family home one last time to sign the deed over and settle the inheritance peacefully. When I arrived, the house felt like a structure under terminal stress, quiet, brittle, and hollow. "The paperwork is in the study, Selah," Vera said, standing by the fireplace. She looked small in her modest navy dress, her grieving widow costume. Dax was nowhere to be seen. "I need to check the basement foundation first," I said, my engineer's instinct overriding the silence. "The drainage pipe has been backing up since the bridge failure. I won't sign for a house with a compromised slab." I walked down the narrow wooden stairs into the dark, damp basement. The air smelled of mildew and old concrete. I was inspecting a suspicious torsion crack near the primary jackstands when I heard the heavy oak door above me slam shut. The metallic slide of a deadbolt echoed through the floorboards. Dax's voice came through the vents, muffled but distinct. "You should have signed at the ICU, Selah. Now, the state will just find you under the remains of a tragic accidental collapse. The jacks were already failing. Wasn't that your report?" The house groaned above me. I realized Dax had intentionally loosened the temporary support jacks. I didn't scream. Sterling Thorne had once told me that panic is a variable that only leads to a faster collapse. I didn't waste oxygen. I moved to the safe zone I had identified years ago, directly under the reinforced steel I-beam I had helped Sterling install when I was 20. I pulled my encrypted radio from my tool belt. "Kaylin, I'm at the Glastonbury site. Occupant has triggered a structural failure. I am in the safe zone. Activate the emergency GPS and notify Hartford PD." I used a portable hydraulic spreader I kept in my kit to shore up the nearest beam just enough to create a gap in the old coal chute. I crawled through the crawlspace, my high-vis vest catching on the cobwebs, and emerged into the freezing rain just as the basement stairs gave way with a sickening crunch. I saw Dax standing on the lawn, his back to me, watching the house settle with a look of calm indifference. He didn't see me slip into the shadows. 20 minutes later, I was in the back of Kaylin's SUV, parked 2 blocks away. My blazer was caked in basement dust, and my knuckles were scraped raw, but I held the black binder against my chest. Kaylin flipped through the bank records Vera had siphoned. $360,000, Selah, Kaylin said, his voice a low vibration of anger. "That's the total they took from Sterling's accounts and your salary over the years while they were calling you a financial burden in the local papers. They didn't just throw you out, they turned you into a silent debt-clearing machine." He handed me a bottle of water. "You don't need to shout tonight, Selah. Let the paper do the talking. The Hartford Club is waiting." The Hartford Club was a sea of crystal chandeliers and old money. The air smelled of expensive bourbon and practiced dignity. It was a benefit gala in honor of Sterling Thorne, and the community judgment was already in motion. As I walked into the foyer, my phone buzzed with a text from a cousin I hadn't seen in a decade. "Vera's telling everyone you had a psychotic break in her basement today. She says you're erratic and dangerous. Selah, please stay away for your own sake." I ignored it and kept walking, my heels clicking on the marble. I saw Vera near the grand staircase, surrounded by donors. She glided toward me, her face a mask of tragic concern. "Oh, Selah, are you feeling better?" she whispered, loud enough for the nearest group to hear. "We were so worried when you ran off earlier. You seemed so confused about the house." I didn't flinch. I looked her dead in the eye and used the one weapon Sterling had taught me was absolute. "Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice level and cold. "The only thing I'm confused about is why you think this lobby is a safe place for you to be tonight." Vera's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly turned back to the donors. "It's so tragic," she sighed. "Since Sterling's accident, Selah's been having these episodes. The trauma of her childhood is just resurfacing." The crowd looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. I didn't defend myself. I just gripped the binder tighter and looked toward the podium. I saw Judge Miller, Sterling's oldest colleague, on the bench. He noticed the dust on my jacket and the set of my jaw. He gave me a single slow nod. He knew. The master of ceremonies stepped up to announce the Sterling Thorne Memorial Grant. Before he could speak, Vera glided onto the stage, her hand reaching for the microphone with the entitlement of a queen. "Before we begin the ceremony," Vera said, her voice amplified and shaking with fake emotion. "As Sterling's closest family contact, there is something everyone in this room needs to know about the state of his affairs. And the person he unfortunately chose to trust at the end." She looked directly at me, a triumphant, poisonous glint in her eyes. The room went silent. The trap was set, but as an engineer, I knew something Vera didn't. She was standing on the very piece of the structure I had already decided to remove. The Hartford Club was a sea of black ties and shimmering silk. A string quartet stood near the marble fireplace, playing something by Bach, orderly, mathematical, and cold. The air smelled of expensive bourbon and the practiced dignity of people who believed that wealth was a shield against the truth. Vera was at the center of the room, holding a glass of vintage cristal, her face a mask of dignified sorrow. Dax stood just behind her shoulder, his chin tilted up, looking every bit like the successor to a legacy he had done nothing to earn. I stood near the heavy velvet curtains at the very back of the hall. I hadn't changed my clothes. My charcoal blazer still held the gray dust of the Glastonbury basement in its fibers, and my hands were still slightly red from the effort of the hydraulic pump. I didn't reach for a drink. I just watched the way the light hit the ice in their glasses. I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to witness a structural failure. Vera didn't wait to be introduced. She glided to the podium, her modest navy dress catching the soft glow of the chandeliers. "Sterling was a giant," she began, her voice amplified and trembling with a precisely measured amount of emotion. "But he was also a man who took on burdens he shouldn't have. Our family has spent 17 years trying to mitigate the damage caused by a daughter who simply couldn't handle the reality of her own instability. We ask for your patience and your prayers as we transition his estate into safer, family-held hands. It is what Sterling would have wanted, protection for the name Vance." The crowd murmured in sympathy. Pity flowed toward her like a tide. I didn't shout liar. I didn't move. I let her words hang in the air until the silence became uncomfortable. I watched Judge Miller's face in the front row. I watched the court reporter's pen stop moving. The silence in the room began to take on a weight of its own. Then, the heavy double doors at the side of the hall opened. Thomas Mercer, Sterling's longtime attorney, walked onto the stage. He wasn't carrying a trophy or a plaque. He was carrying a black box with a thick crimson wax seal. "Before we toast to family hands," Thomas said, his voice a steady, judicial baritone that cut through the murmurs, "we need to perform a final audit on the foundation of this house." The projector screen behind Vera flickered to life. It wasn't a slideshow of Sterling's achievements. It was a scanned document, high resolution and unambiguous. Ledger entry, November 15th, 2009. Transaction, $250,000 life insurance payout. Claimant, Vera Vance. Cause of death, accidental fall of Arthur Miller. Evidence attached, affidavit from the medical examiner, suppressed from the public record for 17 years. The room turned into a vacuum. Vera's glass slipped from her hand. It didn't shatter. It just thudded on the thick Persian carpet, the champagne soaking into the wool like a spreading stain. I clicked the remote in my blazer pocket. The screen changed. It was the drone footage from 3 hours ago. Dax's face, illuminated by his own flashlight through the basement window, looking calm and clinical as he turned the key to lock the heavy oak door. Then, a side-by-side comparison. The high-resolution scan of the silver button embossed with a Gothic D found in Sterling Thorne's broken ribs, and the photo of Dax's jacket on the Glastonbury coat rack, missing its matching hardware. Finally, a screenshot of Cressida's text from the cemetery appeared, larger than life. "Let her walk. Maybe the fresh air will clear her delusions." The reaction was a chain of behavior. not words. The donors in the front row, people who had been nodding at Vera's story moments ago, didn't speak. They simply moved. They shifted their chairs away from Vera and Dax. They lowered their glasses. Judge Miller stood up and walked toward the back of the room, his eyes fixed on the exit. I walked to the front of the hall. I didn't take the microphone. In a room this silent, the truth doesn't need to be loud. I am Selah Vance, I said. 17 years ago, I was thrown out in a trash bag because I saw Dax push a man to his death. Tonight, I am the lead forensic engineer on the Glastonbury site failure. I have spent my life learning that you cannot build a home on a corpse and expect the roof to hold. Vera, you asked for my help tonight. You asked me to sign a lie to save a murderer. My answer is the same as it was in the rain. I looked at my mother, then at my brother. I will never help a murderer. Not the one you raised, and not the one who signed the checks to keep him free. That is the boundary. I placed the heavy black binder on the podium and turned my back. Vera reached out, her fingers trembling, her mother narrative finally crumbling under the weight of the ledgers. Selah, baby, we're your blood, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't answer. I walked toward the double doors. The string quartet had stopped playing. The only sound in the grand hall of the Hartford Club was the steady, rhythmic click of my boots on the marble floor and the heavy, metallic thwack of the handcuffs closing on Dax's wrists as Sterling's old friends in the police department finally stepped out of the shadows. The axis of my world had shifted. The structural failure of the Vance family was total. The Hartford Club did not end in a cheer. It ended in the hollow, rhythmic sound of expensive leather shoes echoing on marble as people moved toward the exits in a collective, uncomfortable hurry. There was no grand debate, no shouting matches with the police. The social order of the Vance family didn't just break, it evaporated. I watched a prominent donor, a woman who had been nodding along to Vera's story about my instability only 10 minutes prior, quietly set down her crystal glass and walk away without a word when Vera reached out a trembling hand for support. Dax was remanded without bail that night. The silver button and the drone footage were more than enough for a 20-year sentencing on attempted murder, and the official reopening of the Arthur Miller case from 2009. Vera was placed under immediate investigation for insurance fraud and being an accessory after the fact. Her assets were frozen by the state's attorney within 48 hours. The grieving martyr costume had finally been stripped away, leaving only a woman standing at the center of a room that was suddenly, devastatingly empty. 6 months later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Hartford was draped in a familiar New England gray. I didn't sell the house in Glastonbury, and I certainly didn't move into it. Instead, I used my legal authority as Sterling's sole beneficiary to bring in a specialized demolition crew. I stood on the opposite sidewalk, my hands in my coat pockets, as the excavator's heavy steel claw tore through the master bedroom, the very room where Vera had spent 17 years curating her lies. As the brick and drywall fell, I didn't feel a rush of joy or a sense of revenge. I felt a release of pressure. It was like watching a diseased limb being surgically removed so the rest of the body could finally breathe. When the crew reached the foundation, they found something the original building inspectors had missed. Deep beneath the slab, there was an old drainage pipe that had been intentionally blocked with industrial foam. A amateurish sabotage Dax had likely performed 17 years ago to create emergency repair costs for Vera to claim. We cleared it. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the land beneath that house was dry. In its place, we broke ground for the Thorn Foundation, a transitional home designed specifically for children who arrive with nothing but a black trash bag and a story no one believes. I sat in my new office at the foundation later that evening. I opened my family debts spreadsheet one last time. I didn't archive it for a court case, and I didn't print it out to gloat. I simply hovered the cursor over the file and tapped delete. The $360,000 wasn't a financial loss. It was the price of my exit. It was the most expensive and most valuable structural repair I had ever authorized. I sat there for a long time in the silence, realizing that the hunger I'd carried since I was 10 years old, that desperate, aching need for Vera to finally see me, was simply gone. I no longer needed her to tell me I was enough, or that I was honest, or that I was loved. I had the blueprints of my own life to prove it. I pulled the surgical steel plate Sterling gave me out of my pocket and placed it on my desk. Next to it, I set a small, faded photograph of me at age 5, laughing in the grass before the rain started. I realized then that being strong isn't about being unbroken. It's about knowing how to rebuild when the foundation fails. If you are currently sitting in the wreckage of a structure that was never meant to hold your weight, if you are being told that you are the problem because you can see the cracks, know that you are allowed to walk out before it falls. You are allowed to take your truth and build your own nest. The world didn't collapse when the lies ended. It just finally found its center. And for the first time in 17 years, the house I live in is built on a foundation that will never, ever give way.